unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Alina Chan, who is a scientific advisor at the Broad Institute, also the author of this book called Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. This book came out a couple years ago, and I did interview your co-author, Matt Ridley, a while back. We actually spent most of our time talking about innovation. We managed towards the end of the podcast to talk about the content of this book. And so I want to revisit this content, dig into some detail, but then also kind of talk about some of the broader lessons that we've learned, lessons that might be relevant to people in public health and medicine, but also just generally in the world of, research academics. So first of all, welcome, Alina.
Thanks.
Yeah. So, I think this book is, does an in-depth study of the evidence, right? In a way, it's a scientific research endeavor, and it's trying to answer a very simple question, which is, we experienced this pandemic, and the origins of the virus are still uncertain. And there have been a couple different competing hypotheses, one of which is sort of natural zoonotic transmission, which could take a couple different forms. And then the other is the lab leak hypothesis. And it seems like, this debate, you use this term, you and your co-author use the term burden tennis. And it seems like, while science should ideally be apolitical, and we should not, start off with our conclusions and work backwards, scientists inevitably have to start with some kind of prior. And what I found fascinating about this whole research agenda is that a lot of the debate was really about the prior, right, that you're using. And so, one prior could be that, natural transmission, burden of proof is on, right, lab leak. Another is, lab leak's pretty obvious, right? Burden of proof is on natural transmission. And that choice of prior seemed to reflect all sorts of things, not just your political positions. So, why can't we just start without a prior and, just look to see where the preponderance of evidence is, right? Why is it that we kind of divert so much of our energy towards, selecting our prior in debates like this?
Well, I think the greatest prior existed amongst the Chinese investigators. So back in 2019, December, when they saw just a few cases at the market, that's when the prior already kicked in. For them, they just assumed it was SARS 2003 happening again. And so that completely biased the search. So they only looked for cases, starting from only a few cases linked to the market. They said, we'll go to all the hospitals near the market, we'll stay within the district of the market, and we are only going to test people who are linked to the market or market cases. So that's where the prior already kicked in. And after that, when non-Chinese scientists from people outside of China started weighing in, they saw this biased data. A lot of them were captured by this data, thinking, oh, wow, that's a big bullseye there. So it looks like all the cases are at that market. And so a lot of people really got taken by that narrative. And that's continued 4+ years on now, where you have all these virologists and zoologists and ecologists, and they look at this and they think it's just the same thing happening again and again. It's what we've told people for like decades, and it's the same thing. So on the other hand, there are a lot of people like myself who are more, instead of favoring the norm, we just look at where Occam's razor cuts. And it looks to us like there's a lot of evidence stacking up here, pointing uniquely at that lab in Wuhan.
Mm-hmm. Now, look, by the time that the COVID-19 arrived on the scene, there had been a ton of research into coronaviruses, right? Coronaviruses are not new. We've had them for a long time. And there are a couple of places in the world where this research had really, advanced. And Wuhan, of course, was one of those places, right? So, circa 2019, 2020, what was sort of the state of the art with respect to research into coronaviruses?
So I think coronaviruses are a pretty big group of viruses. In this case, we should focus in on the exact type of virus that causes COVID-19, which is a SARS-like virus. And this is what was highly studied in Wuhan. I don't think it's controversial to say that in 2019, Wuhan had the world's foremost SARS-like virus laboratory. This lab, housed in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, their entire mission for more than a decade was to specifically search out these SARS-like coronaviruses, bring them back to their lab in Wuhan. So they would scour places across South China, Southeast Asia, bring back tens of thousands of samples from not just bats, but wild animals. And even in their proposals, they described going after people, sick people associated with these wildlife trade or living very close to these caves that they found SARS-like viruses in, bring all this back to Wuhan and do a series of routine experiments and then some more advanced experiments that occasionally ended up enhancing these viruses in the lab.
Okay, and so, what's the nature of this research? I mean, is this just purely driven by curiosity? I mean, presumably there are some public health motivations here, right? I mean, if we understand this virus, then we can perhaps, if we understand how it's transmitted, if we understand how it interacts with the body, this is going to help us to what? Were they intending to develop vaccines as a result of this research?
The story here began with the first SARS-like epidemic, which was 2003. So after that epidemic broke out in China, there was a great interest in Chinese investigators, especially to find out how this had happened so that they could prevent it from happening again. And back then, these Wuhan scientists teamed up actually with US scientists, Peter Daszak, who is now the president of an EcoHealth Alliance, a nonprofit based in New York. And since then, in the past 2 decades, they've built up this whole campaign to go out there and hunt down these natural viruses in really isolated habitats and in the wildlife trade. And their mission was to predict and to prevent the next pandemic. Not that they actually fulfilled this mission, you see, because when COVID-19 happened, none of their research over more than 10 years did anything to prevent, predict, or to inform the response to this pandemic. So I would say that they actually failed on all of these fronts, even though that was their story. They said, we're going to get all these new viruses, we're going to figure out how they infect people, how they could infect people, and then we're going to make therapeutics or anything. But none of their work contributed to any of the vaccines, any of the therapeutics that were widely used in the US.
Mm-hmm. And this is part of this broader project, right? The global virome project, right? To kind of map out just how viruses work, and particularly the kind of viruses that presumably infect humans and, our livestock, they matter too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so why there's certain sources of zoonotic diseases like, cattle and rats and so forth, but it seems like bats harbor a lot of viruses. I mean, is it because their lifestyle seems to be very similar to ours, right? They live in these densely populated environments. Have bats been sort of the object of study for most of these virologists or coronavirologists?
Yes, I would say that I think bats, aside from humans, are probably the most interesting mammalian species out there for virologists. It's because these bats have been found to carry so many different types of pathogens, many of which can jump into people. So like Ebola, coronaviruses, both MERS and SARS were found to have come from bat reservoirs, for example. But they're quite similar to humans in the context that they live in large groups. So you go into one of these caves, easily millions of bats in there. But actually, they're quite different. So they can fly. And so their body has to adapt to handle that kind of really high heat that happens when you're flapping your wings at such a high speed. And that is related to traits in bats that help them to coexist with so many of these viruses. So these viruses, while they cause very severe diseases in people, in bats, they actually just live mostly in the gut and they don't cause any severe disease. So bats have this invulnerability in that sense to all these very dangerous pathogens. And so some of these scientists, for example, the EcoHealth Alliance, they had proposed vaccinating bats in the wild, similar to how we've been vaccinating some of our domesticated animals to try and prevent them from spreading diseases and those diseases from then jumping into people. But I think this was a totally wild idea, and I have to say, after looking at all of their research and the things like that, I strongly advocate against vaccinating bats in the wild. I think we should frankly leave them alone. Leave these bats alone. Stop sending tourists and scientists in there. I think I don't see any benefit in vaccinating bats in the wild to prevent them from transmitting diseases to us.
Yeah, and when I read about all of these different diseases that came from animal reservoirs, how have we figured out exactly when and how and where these things, got transferred into the human population? I mean, is it sort of like doing family tree analysis where you look for proximities? So we can say, oh yeah, this smallpox looks very similar to, right, what you see, living in, I don't know, cows and so forth. I mean, how do we kind of back out where these things came from or are likely to have come from?
It differs from case to case, but I'd say that a lot of experts, virologists, for example, they strongly believe in surveilling human population. So surveilling for emerging diseases, things that actually have jumped into domesticated animals or into people. And I fully agree with that. We should be vigilant. We should be looking for novel diseases jumping into people. In terms of outbreaks, specific outbreaks, trying to track them, it can be quite different. But I like to compare the case of COVID-19 to SARS and MERS, which are also similar, more closely related coronaviruses to each other, especially SARS 2003, which happened in almost exactly the same kind of context, like the same very densely populated Chinese city. There's a market involved. It's the same type of virus, similar traits in terms of being able to spread airborne through the air. So in the case of SARS 2003, for example, they noticed that a lot of the earliest cases, the index cases, were people who had directly handled these intermediate hosts. So these mammals, they're more similar to humans than bats are, and more likely to harbor viruses that can jump more easily into people compared to one directly from a bat. And so a lot of these were chefs, they were waitresses who were handling these animals as well. There were delivery people who would take these animals to the restaurants, and even people who bought these animals from markets and would be slaughtering them at home. And so in that case, they clearly laid out all of the evidence for this virus, the 2003 SARS virus, having jumped from those intermediate hosts into people, because they found the contact, they found antibody evidence, they found these animal variants of the virus in those animals. So there's an extremely clear, series of proofs, for this being a natural origin. And all of these evidence are currently missing for COVID-19.
So when they mapped out the transmission dynamics, right, the cross-species dynamic of, right, SARS-CoV-1 and with MERS, part of it was a genetic analysis, but part of it was also, right, looking at the historical context and looking at sort of the anthropological context and looking at the life histories of the people who were in the specific areas where this was first identified, right? So it seems like you use a variety of techniques, of forensical techniques, to kind of figure out where this stuff comes from, right?
Yes, so it's not just genetic or even purely scientific, but there's quite a bit of investigation happening, more forensics type, and sometimes even intelligence type collection, right? So you have to get information from the doctors, from the people who are infected. Sometimes these pieces of information are hidden or obscured, so you have to actively go and get answers from them. So you can't just look at the genome of a virus and say, aha, it came from a bat or it came from a civet cat at the market. There's an actual almost like a police type investigation.
And now I remember with SARS-CoV-1, I mean, we were able to control it fairly successfully. I mean, completely successfully, but fairly quickly, in part because it was not terribly transmissible, right? Or at least the transmission happened along with symptoms, right? So what was it about, right, COVID-19 that made it different?
So the virus that causes COVID-19, the name is SARS-CoV-2, and there was actually a huge fight about how it was going to be named, because a lot of the Chinese scientists didn't want this to be associated with the first SARS virus. They just wanted to call it a novel coronavirus. So SARS-CoV-2 is quite different from SARS-1. So SARS-CoV-2 at the time in 2019 had a fairly long incubation period before symptoms would appear. So people could be asymptomatic for 2 weeks before symptoms would suddenly appear. And the range of symptoms were so vast. You could have no symptoms all the way up to death. So, the range of symptoms that was there was no way you could immediately say for sure I have SARS-CoV-2, that I have COVID. It's like you could have diarrhea, you could lose your sense of smell or taste, you could have sore throat, fever. It blended itself into all the common colds at the time. And people could spread it asymptomatically. So you could have no symptoms and yet be infectious. So how do you do contact tracing in that sense? So this virus was extremely stealthy and again, highly transmissible. Airborne virus could spread through the air. You could walk into a room that had poor ventilation and 50 people in the room will all get infected. So I mean it was quite different in that sense from SARS-CoV-1. I would say it's much more difficult to trace, much more difficult to contain virus than SARS-CoV-1.
Now, is that normal? I mean, I know it's not, we don't really have a ton of direct experience with these diseases once they cross over into, humanity. I mean, I've read a lot about the Russian flu, which I think most people believe is one of the coronaviruses. And it seemed to be that there was this huge spike in mortality that then kind of, faded away as it became endemic. But, I mean, do these diseases typically start off highly transmissible, or does it require some type of environmental, pressure cooker in order to make them more transmissible? I mean, it seemed the 1918 flu really only came about because of or at least only acquired its high mortality rate because of the crowded conditions of army training camps and trenches and so forth.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to generalize, as you said, given so few samples, so few outbreaks we can compare to each other. That's why I like to stay to viruses that are as similar to each other as possible in terms of transmission, especially because you can't really compare something that spreads through like physical contact versus something that spreads through the air. And I think in the case of SARS and MERS, at least with other similar coronaviruses, you could see that these viruses were not extremely well adapted for causing large sustained outbreaks in people. And you saw many instances in those cases, especially for MERS, that there were numerous dozens and dozens of attempts of these viruses to try and cause outbreaks in people. They try to infect people, but rarely did they ever transmit enough to cause an outbreak. But in the case of COVID-19, I think there is no debate. Like everyone agrees, even if you are 100% in on the raccoon dog market spillover hypothesis, you also agree, and this is in the science papers published by those proximal origin authors. We can get into that later. They say that no evolution was needed for this virus to cause a pandemic. So there's no one is disagreeing anymore on this point. They all agreed that COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, was extremely well adapted for causing this pandemic.
Right, and so if you're trying to collect evidence in favor of the human engineering aspect of this, I mean, what is it about? Is that the key thing? Is it the mechanism that made it so well adapted to humans that makes it's highly unlikely that something would have come directly or that quickly from an animal reservoir that would have been that transmissible in humans?
I think it's difficult to say, but if you consider that ultimately this was a bat coronavirus, how did it go from bats, which are quite different from humans? So a virus well adapted for spreading in bats would not be expected to spread very well in humans. How did it go from a bat adapted virus to one that's so good at causing pandemics in humans, and not just humans actually? In this case, it's caused all these outbreaks in white-tailed deer and mink in the farms in Europe especially. So this virus clearly it is extremely prolific at jumping from species to species. So in this case, there are three arguments. So the first is that just right from the get-go, from bats, it jumped into animal and boom, it was it's good at infecting all these different species. The other is that maybe it spent some time at intermediate host, and that's how it picked up a lot of these adaptations that caused it to be so good at spreading in these type of mammals.
And that's what happened with MERS and SARS-CoV-1, right? They did not come directly from bats, but came through these intermediate species, right?
Yes, in the case of SARS, it was civet cats that were mainly identified, but there were also other animals at these markets like raccoon dogs and badgers that were found to be positive for these viruses. In the case of MERS, it was camels. So a lot of these camels would go to chill out, to roost where all these bats were, and then people who closely handled these camels were the ones who were the index cases. So the last option is that maybe SARS-CoV-2 had already spent some time in people, so circulating at a very low level, and we just had no idea until it caused a huge outbreak in Wuhan. And I think these are not totally distinct from lab scenarios, because actually in the labs, what people were doing routinely and in many labs was that they were taking these novel viruses, and to grow them in the lab, to do experiments with them, you had to grow them in other types of cells. So what a lot of virologists use are primate cells. So you take these viruses from bats or from other animals and throw them into dishes full of primate cells, monkey cells, and try to select for these viruses that could replicate, infect and replicate these cells very efficiently. And you do the same thing in human cells as well. So in the lab, you were simulating processes that were existing in nature, where the virus is passing through all these different types of species.
So you're basically accelerating evolution, right?
Yes, you're forcing it. And so in one paper, for example, from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they had taken this bat coronavirus and thrown it into a dish of primate cells. And they found that it was only after about 5 rounds of pushing it through these cells that they saw one that was growing very well. And then they used that for their experiments. So this was a routine
so it's basically
process.
like creating these military camps, right? Like creating, simulating what it would be like to
training
have,
camps.
or trench warfare or whatever. Like you're jamming these humans so close, these human-like cells so close together that the evolution, which would normally lead to, right, more transmissibility and perhaps the constraint on lethality would be removed, right?
I'm not sure about the constraint on lethality, because the way that they would see these viruses growing well is that they would be killing all the cells in that part of the dish. So they were certainly selecting for something that could grow and infect these cells very quickly.
And so this is the gain of function research, right?
So I mean, gain of function is a very broad term, and the one that was used specifically by the U.S. government back in those days before the pandemic is that gain of function research of concern only concerns pathogens that were known to be both highly transmissible and highly deadly in people. So if you took all these natural viruses that had never been found to infect people, how would you know that they were highly transmissible and highly deadly? So it was through this large loophole that a lot of this research happened. I think a lot of virologists, even those on the natural origin side, do view this type of work, some of the work at the Wuhan Institute, as gain of function. So in one case, for example, they took some of these novel SARS-like viruses from bats and they they switched some of the genes in and out. And they noticed in at least one case that they caused a 10,000-fold increase in viral load in the lungs and brains of humanized mice. So these are mice that outfitted with a human receptor that SARS-like viruses used to infect humans. These mice showed greater mortality and weight loss and higher viral loads using the chimeric synthetic viruses in the lab. So in this case, clear gain of function had occurred, but that still would not have met the US government standard, because the US government standard was that it had to be known to cause high mortality and high transmissibility in people.
But was this kind of research being done in the US? I mean, was the main difference kind of the type of research, or is it really the level of the safety protocols, right? The BSL, right, 4, 3, and 2?
Yes, similar research was being done, and actually I would say they were platformed in the US before being the same ideas and techniques were then taken by Chinese and other scientists. So, I mean, the US is a big leader in virology, and oftentimes the experiments that are done for the first time, the groundbreaking experiments, they make it into very prestigious scientific journals. And then from there, everyone else around the world is saying, I want to do that too. I want to publish in these top journals. I want to be in Science. I want to be in Nature. And it looks like the best way to do that is to copy these very risky but high impact, very controversial, like attention grabbing kind of experiments. And I would say in their defense, though, that I don't think any of these virologists deep in their hearts felt like they were capable of causing a pandemic. So they must have at the time thought that the risk, the perceived risk, were overinflated, were like, imaginary or something, So because how would you be able to work as a scientist if you went into the lab every day thinking that you could cause a pandemic that kills millions of people? So I think they kind of underestimated the risk of their work, and they were just driven by the incentives of the system to do this kind of really novel work that no one else could do and then get it into the top journal.
Right, but still, even if there's a very low probability of it causing negative outcomes accidentally, you still want safety protocols. So, what is the difference between, right, BSL 2, 3, and 4, and what is the agreed upon safety standard for this type of experimentation in the U.S. and why would they use sort of a different standard in China?
With these novel viruses collected in nature, I would say that there was no clear standard. So with known human outbreak pathogens, there are standards. So for example, at the time, SARS from the 2003 epidemic was seen as a more dangerous virus. So you had to work with it at a higher biosafety level, like BSL-3 specifically. Meanwhile, MERS was not seen as that dangerous because it was not that transmissible. So actually some people worked with it at lower biosafety levels. But if you look at these novel SARS-like viruses and MERS-like viruses from the wild, there's no standard. So in the US, there were some labs like at University of North Carolina, where Ralph Baric, a very well-known coronavirologist, is. He handled these viruses. He did these experiments where you recombine the viruses at BSL-3. So there's a much higher biosafety standard than what was used in China at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where these viruses were grown, they were mixed and matched at BSL-2. So even though BSL-2 and 3 are separated by only one number, it's actually a very large jump in terms of biosafety. So at biosafety 3, you have biohazard suits, you even have like security cameras and things like that. People go through hours and hours of training. Every step is measured to make sure that you're protected against an airborne virus. But at BSL-2, none of these protections exist. So these conditions vary greatly around the world. There are some BSL-2 labs where no jacket is even needed, no lab coat is even needed. There's no personal respirator or anything. No masks are required, and then certainly no cameras. And even if you get sick, you don't have to report it because no one would suspect that you're working with a pathogen of that kind of risk. And that's the level that was used in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And in one of the research proposal drafts shared between Ralph Baric and this with the Wuhan scientists, Ralph Baric noted that in the US, you use BSL-3, and that US researchers would freak out if they saw that they were doing this work at BSL-2.
So why was China using BSL-2? Is it just a matter of cost, or was it a difference in the perception around the danger?
I think both, because these Wuhan scientists had been working with these viruses. They climbed into these caves, sometimes with no mask, no protection whatsoever, surrounded by millions of biting, scratching, pooping bats. And then, it's kind of hard to tell them, oh, now they've taken the samples. You must now BSL-3 up. So you must now work at a level that costs millions and millions of dollars, like very high cost level. And it's very inefficient to work at that level. You have to plan all these experiments out extremely carefully, and you have to have the exact precise personnel. It's a huge barrier to doing this work efficiently and quickly. But of course you need it when you're actually dealing with a pandemic risk pathogen, right? But so for them, having been in all these caves doing this type of work at BSL-2 for so long, I'm sure that their guards were greatly lowered. They no longer perceived these viruses as actual threats, as capable of causing pandemics. But there's of course also the cost. So if you're gonna be competitive, you're gonna find ways to cut costs and to do things faster. And this is true for everyone. This is not just a China thing, although clearly this is happening in China too. Is that even in the US, right, with funding dwindling, with so many scientists working on the same problems, you have to find ways to beat the competition. And unfortunately, in this exact area where there actually is a risk of causing a pandemic, I think that the costs to the public are intolerable.
Mm-hmm. Now, if we just look at the kind of the sequence, right, the signature of the virus, that's not determinative, right? That doesn't answer the question of whether it was naturally transmitted or lab leak, right?
Yeah. So this is a big. This is a question worth a lot of money. So I would say that there are funding agencies, research agencies, Defense Department, Intelligence Department in the States who have invested millions of dollars into trying to answer this question. Can you look at the genome or the sequence of a novel pathogen and tell whether it came from a lab? And the answer is no, because the technology to synthesize these viruses or pathogens without leaving a trace already existed before the pandemic, many years before the pandemic. And it was exactly in the wheelhouse of this Wuhan lab to be making these genomes without leaving a trace. So they were
So there's no like
copying
human
nature.
signature. It's not like there's not going to be a little
No.
autograph like made by,
No.
right?
Why would anyone do that? It just it causes trouble for you, right? If it leaks from a lab, or I mean, trying to put in all these signatures, you could also perturb the genes. You could perturb the function of those pathogens. So you want to keep it as natural as possible.
So without a watermark, right, to tell us that this is from a lab, then we have to kind of go and start doing a little bit of digging, right? And we got to go back and look for these pathways. And so there's been a lot of research into the potential intermediary, right, that might have taken it from bats to humans. And there's been, all sorts of candidates, right? What have been some of the candidates, and why have they been ruled out, or at least, has there been insufficient evidence to support all of the different candidates?
So I would say that as a summary, there has not been any evidence of such a candidate. So there's no evidence of any such animal being infected at the market. So if you go rewind the clock 4+ years to early 2020, it's just people posting all these videos of Chinese people eating all sorts of animals, like from bat soups to pangolins, to civet cats and that kind of thing. So there were a whole bunch of animals that were under suspicion.
And it's true,
at
like
the time.
people do that, right, in China. I mean, that's not, those weren't fake videos.
Well, some of them were actually videos that were not from China. So the bat soup videos were certainly not from Wuhan. And it actually came out later that market had not sold any bats or live pangolins at all. And so it's worth noting that Wuhan is like the Chicago of China. This was a scientific hub. If you look at Google photos of Wuhan, it is extremely advanced, just all these skyscrapers and stuff, far outstripping many actually US cities, I'm sorry to say. But if you Google photos of Wuhan, you see that this was a highly high-tech city, it's just like full of people, very huge city. It wasn't known for its wildlife trade or anything like that, unlike the southern Chinese provinces during the 2003 SARS epidemic. So it really was like night and day. So for example, if you looked at the 2003 SARS epidemic, the province where it broke out in, it was known to be consuming something on the order of 10,000 civet cats a day in that province. I mean, there's an incredible amount of these cats being eaten. There was a culture at the time. This was more than 2 decades ago. But in Wuhan, it's not. There wasn't that kind of taste. Yes, there were about 4 markets in the city, and there were some stores selling these wildlife products, but it wasn't at that level. In fact, if you go talk to the scientists who were studying the animals at these markets before the pandemic, they found that on average across the entire city, across all the markets there, you would only see a few dozen of these plausible intermediate hosts being sold. But in 2020, people really thought it was the pangolins, right? And this was so pervasive that it even was featured by South Park in their pandemic special episode as like pangolin causing the pandemic. But till today, there has not been such a link in Wuhan city. There were no pangolins being sold in that market. So how did it cause an outbreak in Wuhan of all places?
And so what was being sold in this market?
So this
Mostly
market was
fish,
largely,
right?
a seafood market, as its name
has
suggests.
Has seafood ever been an intermediate
No.
vehicle for transmission of any pathogens to humans?
I would say that you can get parasites from fish, but viruses, I don't think so. I think we're too evolutionarily distinct from fish to be catching such viruses.
Certainly
from
more
them.
different than bats, right?
Yes, very extremely
Yes.
different from bats. I mean, the hypothesis that China favors is that the virus was imported into China through the cold chain, through frozen food, which could include frozen fish. But there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that this could happen and to so successfully then cause an outbreak. So, I mean, they've accused almost a whole bunch of people, almost just randomly. They were like, oh, it's the salmon from the Faroe Islands. It's the lobsters from Maine. It's just, they're just throwing whatever they can onto the wall to see what sticks.
But I like how the Chinese government at one point said that it was due to a lab leak in North Carolina.
Oh yeah. when their own lab, when the Wuhan lab fell under increasing suspicion, that's when they switched it around and said, oh, it was their collaborators at that University of North Carolina that sent the virus to them and set them up. So, there have been a lot of pretty speculative hypotheses being thrown about.
Well, wouldn't it be easy to figure out whether it was a lab leak by just simply looking at the records of the lab, right? I mean, don't labs keep detailed records of their research?
But China refused to share those records. And in fact, a pathogen sample database describing more than 22,000 pathogen samples had been taken offline by this lab, the Wuhan lab, in the fall of 2019. So after September 2019, there was no longer any more external access into this database. And what that database could have shown us was how many samples they'd taken from which sites in China and Southeast Asia, and what viruses they found in these samples. So we lost insight into that collection.
Now, I mean, is there any plausible reason why they would want to remove this data or deny access to this data other than to sort of conceal any evidence in favor of a lab leak? I mean, is there any legitimate scientific reason? Have they offered any kind of explanation for this concealment of the information?
Yes, when questioned about it, they gave two different excuses at different times. So sometimes they would say it's because they were upgrading their database, their website, and other times they would say it's because they were being hacked already in the fall of 2019, way before anyone knew about the pandemic. And maybe I could buy the upgrading part, but when the pandemic started, they should have released it. They should have shared it with collaborators at least, because the whole purpose of this this pathogen sample database was to help track and inform the origins of future outbreaks. So here we go. That's the biggest outbreak of exactly the type of virus you're studying, and you're refusing to share this database. What reason do you have for this?
Now, was the Chinese government behavior different with SARS-CoV-1? I mean, was there much more sort of sharing of information and collaboration on interventions and so forth?
In both cases, there were clear efforts to suppress information about each outbreak being released to the press. So in the case of the 2003 epidemic, for example, China tried as much as possible not to let people know how widespread that outbreak was. So they even had a case where when the World Health Organization sent investigators in, the patients would be hidden in elevators in the hospital or hidden in ambulances driving all around the city to try and prevent the investigators from knowing how many cases there were. And in a similar way for COVID-19, until today, we have no clear understanding of how many early cases there were, partly because the virus is so stealthy and highly transmissible, and then the fact that there's so many types of symptoms you can have that an estimated only about 3 to 6% of people would have ended up in hospital at the time. So until today, we have such difficulty knowing who were the earliest known cases. So that there's some rumors that there are November cases that are known to the Chinese authorities, but they have not shared that data. We just do not know how many cases there were at the time.
Now, I think you mentioned that there was some evidence that there was some kind of outbreak of illness in the Wuhan lab itself.
Yes.
In the fall of 2019. What kind of evidence do we have for that?
So those are intelligence that collected by U.S. agencies. And I can say that I probably know a bit more about this than the public does, but I cannot speak about it. But it is credible that there were at least three scientists in that Wuhan Institute that fell ill in the fall of 2019 with symptoms that are consistent with COVID-19. So in the latest report released by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, they said that there were symptoms that were inconsistent. But, for someone on the outside, what symptoms could possibly be inconsistent with COVID-19? Because, what exactly are these symptoms that you think could not be consistent? So at this point, I'd say, suffice to say that it could have been COVID-19. We will never know because we can't get their blood samples.
Now, you mentioned in the beginning of the epidemic, in the early January, February of 2020, that there was remarkably little curiosity about the origins of the pandemic among scientists. Why is that? Is it just because people were so concerned about, how to remedy the problem, that this was a problem for a later day, or was I mean, why you'd think that would be something that scientists would be super curious about.
I think there are two things. So the first thing is that, the Chinese government itself in January 2020 already told everyone that it was from the market. So it was the Chinese CDC. They told the global news that this came from those illegally sold animals at that market. So for a lot of people, it was case closed. They were like, okay, it's settled. We all agree it's from that market. So let's focus on dealing with this. And the second thing is a lot of people were saying that this wasn't going to be a big deal. So there were a lot of people saying this is not even going to be a pandemic. It's going to go away. And this included virologists and doctors, by the way. It wasn't just Trump. So it wasn't just Trump saying it's going to be gone by Easter. At the time in early 2020, actually a lot of doctors, and I remember seeing some of my friends even saying this, who are doctors, just saying, don't worry about this. Just go get your flu shot. This is nothing. So those were the sentiments in early 2020. And the problem is that it did become a pandemic. And that the Chinese government was wrong. They didn't have the evidence to show that it definitely came from the market. So after so much time passed, it became more and more difficult to collect evidence that could definitively point at either a market or lab origin.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, the Chinese government to this day is not sharing information that would help unravel this mystery. I mean, does the Chinese government have its own internal investigators that are conducting this type of research to figure this out, and they're simply not sharing the results? Or are Chinese investigators themselves being denied access to this information?
I think it's mostly the latter. So when this outbreak happened, I would say it was chaos. So there were lots of different people investigating. They weren't all coordinated in a giant conspiracy to do a cover-up. But you could see that the local CDCs were involved. The larger Chinese CDC went in separately also. Numerous Chinese scientists, professors also went in trying to find out what had happened. And some of those scientists have been punished to date. So one of them actually has been locked out of his lab for sharing the first SARS-CoV-2 genome with the world. He also collected numerous samples, including from raccoon dogs in the area, and he showed that none of them had these sort of viruses. None of them had these sort of SARS-like viruses in Wuhan and in the greater province of Hubei. So he has been locked out of his lab. So I would say that he has become a martyr in terms of showing that he really tried to find the origin of COVID-19, to study its virus, and he's being punished for it. Furthermore, if you go back to 2020, by March, the Chinese government had already sent out missives to all of these universities and institutes telling them, don't publish anything on the origins. Anything you want to publish on the origins has to go through like at least 4 levels of approval, like within the institute and even up through the government. So people were highly disincentivized from continuing to investigate.
Well, it seems like even in the United States, there was, this type of inquiry was discouraged, and public health officials were, I think they were implying that if you entertained this hypothesis that you were in some way anti-science, anti-China. I mean, why would public health officials and people in the scientific community want to discourage this type of inquiry?
So it's important to point out what we know today about this. So there were some very influential scientific leaders, not just in the US, but the UK, who already in January 2020 were worried about a lab outbreak causing this outbreak. So at the time, they didn't know it was a pandemic yet, but they were all really concerned that this virus had leaked out of that Wuhan lab. And they were convening meetings, calls, emailing back and forth across numerous European countries and the US, trying to decide if they should put out a letter to the public, trying to shut down the lab leak hypothesis and to help dismiss all of these conspiracy theories, although they privately worried about a lab origin. So this resulted in the publication of a letter called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2. It was published in a highly prestigious journal, Nature Medicine, saying that no lab-based scenarios are plausible. And yet, the first author, the lead author of this paper, even a whole month after it was published, according to his messages that are now released, we could see that he was still worried. He said, we can't rule out lab manipulation. We can't even rule out genetic engineering using the genome of this virus. So we only have his messages up to April 2020. And I think it's imperative that the congressional committees that have the power to subpoena these messages continue to see what else they said after April 2020.
So what would be the motivation? Would it be concern that this would result in a, discrediting of the scientific community? Would it mean perhaps the end of this type of research?
I think they were worried about two things. So one was the geopolitical backlash that could happen. One of these authors of this letter, Proximal Origin, said that it would be a shit show, if they said that it came from a Chinese lab. But the second part of it is that this type of research was not specific to that Wuhan lab. So surely, yes, the SARS-like virus research was specific to that lab, but across the world, and for more than a decade before the pandemic started, there were virologists everywhere, including Drs. Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins in the US, who had advocated for that type of research, said that this work is a risk worth taking. And they were speaking in the context of making a flu virus more transmissible in humans. So they wanted to encourage work that continues on to today even, to make a fairly deadly bird flu more transmissible in ferrets and therefore in humans. So they wanted to study this process in the lab so that they could look for similar mutations or adaptations in natural viruses to then see which ones were the greatest threats to people. So for a decade before the pandemic, they had been endorsing this sort of work. So if such work actually gave rise to a pandemic, they would fall under that kind of blame and responsibility.
So, is it about avoiding retroactive blame, or is it about preventing proactive, constraints on additional research?
I think it's both. So since then and over the past few years, you've seen so many letters by virologists. So dozens of them have signed letters saying we are totally fine in the US. We do not need any more oversight or regulation. We are good at self-auditing and self-inspecting. We don't need any external oversight over our work. So there's a clear fear amongst virologists that if this pandemic was started by a lab accident in Wuhan, they would become constrained as well. And that people would also perceive them to no longer just be the good guys, but to be a source of risk, of danger.
But this is valuable research, right? Should we continue with this research, but just make sure that we're doing so at a higher level of security?
Yeah, I have a fairly moderate viewpoint on this. There are definitely people who think that all of this research should be banned, but I think that there should be a certain amount allowed to continue. So again, this sort of research where there's actually any pandemic risk constitute an extremely small fraction of virology. So I would say like less than even 1%, maybe even less than that. So most virology doesn't even concern animal viruses. And those that do often do not pose a risk to cause outbreaks in people. But there are these types of research projects that are now becoming more and more trendy around the world, following in the footsteps of US leaders to take these pathogens that could cause outbreaks in people and study them in the labs. And it's unclear where the risk is. Is it because some of these labs are doing it at such low biosafety levels? Or is it because that there are so many of these high biosafety labs now and the work is increasing, and yet in these labs, there's still room for human error. So in the case of SARS 2003, for example, once it started being studied in labs, it leaked from all sorts of high biosafety labs. It leaked from BSL-2s, BSL-3s, and even BSL-4s. There's a whole level up. The highest biosafety level even leaked from such a lab. So I would say that this sort of research is becoming more and more trendy. And we should do something about it. Not to ban it completely, but to do it in very safe ways with external oversight.
No, in the book you talk about other lab leaks that we've had. It's kind of surprising that we still have the smallpox virus, for instance, sitting somewhere in a vial. What possible justification could we have for keeping something like that around? If that got out, that is a 30% infection fatality rate, right? This could wipe out entire, millions of people who have not received or received their I think the smallpox vaccine, does it fade after a while? I don't know. Most people don't get smallpox vaccine anymore, right? This would just devastate the world. Is there any real justification for keeping it around?
I think yes, because there's still similar viruses existing in the wild. And as a scientist, you often don't want to destroy everything in the lab. You want to just keep in a highly safe and contained space, right? But unfortunately, that has not been the case. So there have been leaks of smallpox. There have been samples of smallpox sort of just left thawing on carts or just forgotten in freezers. So it's again this idea of the ideal situation versus what's happening in reality, right? Like, yes, we want to find all these novel viruses, we want to catalog everything, we want to find cures for everything, but the execution is disastrous. The execution has so much pandemic risk.
So the biological evidence, the historical evidence, and the circumstantial evidence point towards a lab leak, right? But if it's a lab leak, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways or stories that you could tell about the lab leak. And some people talk about this research as having some military application or
Yes.
Bioweapons. And I think, there is some evidence that there is research into bioweapons. I know there's a lot of evidence of Russian research into bioweapons in the late Soviet period that only came out fairly recently. What would be a bioweapon application of something like this? Would it be to develop a new type of virus and simultaneously develop the vaccine and then have, privileged access to the vaccine that one would administer to one's own population? Would that be the idea? I mean, I doubt that you would develop the weapon without also developing some antidote, right? Is there research, military-like research? Do we have any evidence of military involvement in this type of research?
Yes, there's actually quite a bit evidence. So according to the intelligence agencies in the US, there was actually quite a lot of PLA activity, so Chinese military activity at the WIV. So the WIV was China's first highest biosafety lab. So it had all these levels. You had BSL-2 all the way up to BSL-4, the highest level. So it's not surprising to me that there would be some military research there at the country's most premier virological institute. And they've said that in their intelligence reports as well, that they know that military scientists were using the WIV to do research, including on coronaviruses. But the level of insight is not that high resolution, so we don't know exactly what they were doing. We don't know whether, for example, they were taking all these SARS-like viruses and trying to develop vaccines for them. And we don't know the motives. So we don't know if they were doing it for biodefense or bioweaponry. Some would say the lines there are very blurred, because sometimes to try and develop defenses, you have to develop the offenses. So I just think that these labs should not be located in the middle of cities anymore, because I think that people are making all these weapons and things, but rarely do they deploy them, especially these live weapons, because you don't know what will happen with them. So if you release these viruses, they adapt. So no matter what you program to do them in the beginning, they will find a way around it if there's an incentive to get around it. So you could some very bizarre people are trying to develop viruses or pathogens that target only specific races. That's just not going to work. The virus is going to find a way to break into new populations of people. And there's no way you can fully vaccinate your entire population and prevent against disease. Like even with COVID-19, you can get boosted to the max and you still get COVID in a few months when the new variant emerges. So that there's no foolproof defense against a released pathogen. You have no way of predicting how it's going to evolve out there in the real world. So if you're gonna make all these weapons just for fun, I think that these labs should be completely relocated. Just do not put them in the middle of cities with international airports. You put them in the middle of an island in the Caribbean. Sorry, not to pull the Caribbean into this, but you know what I mean. Just find an island where you can have.
Well, China's building lots of little artificial islands in the South China Sea. Maybe that would be a good place to put it, right?
Yeah, and just make sure there's a very strong quarantine protocol, right? So that you don't accidentally release one of these biodefense/bioweapon pathogens.
Well, is the technology for creating these new pathogens, is it something that is democratically available? I mean, could some bad actor decide to, I'm going to go make myself a new coronavirus, right?
No, and there's some scientists who have sort of floated that narrative a bit, saying that, I could train my student to do this in 2 weeks. And I'm like, no, you're greatly underestimating the skill and expertise and experience needed to do this. And so, for example, that Wuhan lab had been working on these type of viruses for more than a decade. So they had all of the skills, they had the experience, they knew what could go wrong in their experiments, they knew what to look for. And you don't just get that from ChatGPT. I'm sorry, you cannot just ChatGPT your way to a bioweapon. I think anyone who thinks that maybe they're just living like many decades in the future and they're not perceptive of today's limitations.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mentioned a couple of people that I was interviewing you and I discussed the theme of the book, and many of them said, wait, what? Lab leak, right? And my understanding is that this is more or less the consensus among people in virology and in microbiology. But it doesn't seem to match the public perception. I mean, the only people who seem to believe the lab leak hypothesis are the ones that sort of had it as their prior, right? Back in I think when Trump was promoting the idea, right? And so it doesn't seem like there's. It seems like the initial prior is very, very sticky. That people, the new evidence that's come in and the careful analysis has been done by you and others, it doesn't seem to filter into the public opinion or consensus. I mean, should we be thankful for that? Like, oh, good, that means that we can keep doing the research, or should we be concerned about that mismatch?
I think we should be concerned, and clearly virologists are concerned. I think many of them are alarmed when they see polls of both Democrats and Republicans and seeing that the majority of them think that it came from a lab. So, your political affiliation doesn't determine anymore whether you think this virus was natural or came through a lab. I would say that the difference between the public and scientists is that scientists, especially experts, they tend to lean on priors very heavily, as well as the peer-reviewed literature. So in this case, where you have all these top scientists and top journals, these are seen in the emails that were released through the Freedom of Information Act, all these top journal editors even saying, no, we don't want to say anything about lab leak. We are completely pro-zoonosis. We're completely natural like origin. So if you have all these journals blocking the publication of letters or analysis suggesting it came from a lab, and then you ask entirely the independent experts to come in and evaluate, they're going to say, but if you look at the peer-reviewed literature, it's all natural. So how could it have come from a lab? So we've seen some recent attempts to gauge what the perception is. And there is one done by the Good Judgment Project where they got in hundreds of experts. And they found that about 1 in 4 experts think it came from a lab, more likely. And the others thought it came from nature, more likely. But this doesn't mean that there's a consensus. It means that there's division. So these experts are divided on this topic. And even a poll of virologists, anonymous poll, found similarly about 1 in 5 of them thought that it was more likely from a lab. So there's actually division. There's no consensus. It isn't like the experts against the public. Even the experts are against the experts.
Oh, I got it backwards. I thought that the consensus was that it was a lab leak at this point. You're saying the consensus among the scientific community is that, or at least the majority of the scientific community still believes that it was natural.
At least within the virology community, so those directly in the field, that was who the survey targets it. It looks like amongst virologists, about 1 in 5 of them think it's from a lab, and 4 in 5 think it's from the market or natural. So I don't think we can extend that to the entire scientific community. That there's certainly other fields where I think the distribution is different. For example, maybe if you went to synthetic biology or bioengineering field, they might think differently about whether this came from the market or the lab, possibly because they have different priors, because they know how easy it is for some of these labs with a lot of skills and expertise to just make these viruses in a couple of weeks. In the public, I also wouldn't say there's a consensus. I mean, there's clearly division. There are people who strongly think it came from a lab, and there are people who strongly think it came from nature. So how do you move past all this division? It's to unearth more evidence. So I was incredibly shocked last year when both the Senate and the House signed off on a bill that was then ratified by President Biden to ask the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to declassify all of the intelligence that could link the Wuhan lab to the pandemic, and the ODNI refused. So they did not declassify any piece of intelligence, and they just put out this extremely brief report that was completely vague. So it looks like that. I mean, if you hear the testimonies of people who have seen this intelligence, most of them say it looks like it came from the lab. So it looks like something is being hidden by the intelligence agencies.
Well, what would need to happen for people to become convinced? I mean, could you have something like the World Health Organization launch an investigation? Would they be credible, or is there just simply too much politics that would get in the way of any kind of objective inquiry?
So the World Health Organization did try to do this in 2020, and they were only let into the country in China in 2021. So in about January 2021, about 10 experts were convened by the World Health Organization. This was a list of experts approved by China to come in. And then they were brought to Wuhan City, but it was not an investigation. They called it a collaborative journey of exploration or something like this. And they were led around on tour through like museums in China, showing them how great China was at handling the pandemic. They were shown the frozen storage of that market. They were shown the extreme high levels of the Wuhan lab, the high biosafety levels, but they were not shown the actual spaces where the coronavirus research had been done. You know, they were just held by the hand, led by the nose through all of the things that China wanted them to see. And then they signed off on the report that China wanted them to publish, which said that it's more likely that this came from frozen food than through the lab. So I'd say that the World Health Organization cannot do anything at this point. They've tried and failed. Yeah.
Now, do you know anything about what people in China think? I mean, it's very hard to tell what people think because the what publicly available discourse is, obviously not a random sample. But is there, and I know there's a lot of people who have a great deal of faith in the government, a lot of people who are very doubtful and skeptical about what the government does. But, when you see some of these things like the frozen fish hypothesis and, it's hard to believe that anybody, believes that. Is there still generally a consensus among Chinese people that this is, have to do with bats and imported food and, the CIA or whatever? I mean, do people believe that in China? Do you know? Do you have any
who's going to run that survey? Who's going to organize and run that survey, right, of Chinese people? But I will say this, in early 2020, one of these authors of the Proximal Origin Letter wrote in an email, he said that I work closely with a lot of Chinese scientists. And remember again, this was a time when China said it came from the market. So this was when China categorically said it came from those animals at the market. He wrote in his emails, they all believe they're being lied to and that it came from that lab. So, I mean, it is anecdotal, but it is what he said, right? So I do think that a lot of people in China highly suspect it's from the lab.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I'm trained as an historian, and so, we tend to believe that sooner or later, you get to figure out what actually happened, right? And over time, the truth comes out. Do you think that this would require a change in government before we would get access to the information and the data that we're looking for?
It's difficult to say. Maybe, yes. So this would be similar to the Soviet Union anthrax outbreak that came from that military lab. It was only after a regime change. Then whistleblowers came out saying, yeah, someone forgot to replace the air filter. And so the anthrax spores blew all over the city in the direction of the wind. In this case of COVID-19, it's really difficult to tell because it's possible that there could be more compelling evidence already sitting in the US from some of these collaborators of the Wuhan scientists that if these were produced, they could encourage whistleblowers to come out, right? So I believe that we don't know enough to know even which lab in that Wuhan Institute was responsible. The bits and pieces we see seem to suggest that it was the lab that was studying all these viruses and collecting them. But if the military were involved, who knows what was happening in that institute, who had access to all their collections and what experiments were happening. So I think that as time passes and maybe as it becomes less and less contentious, or maybe if it becomes even advantageous for people in China to reveal the origin, that kind of information could come out.
Well, Alina, hopefully we'll learn more and you'll be able to report on it and maybe even offer up a second or third edition to this book with additional insights. So thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it. The book's called Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. We'll talk again.
Thanks, Greg. I really enjoyed this conversation.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.